I'm going to play this content right now, and I'm going to give you context. Stay with me for a couple of minutes.
Fight. This is why, Hezbollah has said, if as long as what Israel doesn't cross the line of tolerance, we'll stay out of this fight. And Hamas has told everybody, we got this under control, guys. We don't need you. We got this under control. And they do. They're in total control of the situation. It's callously, they don't care about the people upstairs, or they do, but they're like Charles de Gaulle, they're willing to sacrifice them for the greater good. If you ask the majority of Palestinians, if you could die, give your life for the birth of a Palestinian nation, they would say yes, because for 75 years, that's all they dreamed of. And now, thanks to Hamas, they have that possibility. Hezbollah does not want to be a part of this fight. Iran does not want to be a part of this fight. Again, Iran has met with the Hamas political leadership in Qatar, and we're told the same thing. We don't want you to intervene. We got this under control. What's that tell you? When the Israelis say, we know that Iran gave the green light. Iran knew nothing about this. This took Iran totally by surprise, just like Hezbollah was taken by surprise. And Iran is saying, hey guys, we just normalized relations with Saudi Arabia. Big deal. I mean, it's a huge deal. We are,
which, by the way, was negotiated by China.
By China.
Yeah.
We are now joining BRICS. Right. We're a member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Our focus is economic. We are focusing on getting the economy of Iran, which has been suffering under sanctions for decades, on its feet, moving forward. The last thing Iran needs is a war. And they don't want a war. They want to avoid a war. And they have communicated this to the United States, which is another reason why the United States is telling Israel, you're not going into Gaza, guys, because nobody wants this war. You're going to lose the war. You can't win. And if you go in, you risk turning this into a regional war that nobody wants. Now, we know, if you've read Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August, we know that in World War I, in the summer of 1914, nobody wanted a world war, but everybody slow walked their way to it because it was just one of these things, like a slow-moving traffic accident that you know is going to be horrible, and you're watching it, and you're not doing anything to stop it because it's inevitable. We could be on that path. Hopefully, we're not. Hopefully, the United States has communicated appropriately, not only with Israel, but with Hezbollah and with Iran, that we want to avoid escalation. This is why, if you noticed last night, there was a massive attack against American bases in Syria and Iraq by so-called Shia resistance forces. 24 Americans, according to the news, were wounded, soldiers. One contractor died of a heart attack. Now, normally, this would be the kind of thing that would precipitate massive American counterstrike. But have you seen American bombers in the air dropping bombs? No. Why? Because this is called escalation management. This is where we are going to absorb a certain amount of punishment as sort of like a safety valve. You want to bleed off this pressure, bleed it off. But what you have to ensure when you bleed off the pressure, that you're not doing anything to generate more pressure. Again, let me just make this point. For the first time in a long time, there is a chance for real peace in the Middle East, because you could never talk about genuine peace in the Middle East if it didn't include a legitimate Palestinian state. Thanks to Hamas, thanks to what Hamas did, that option is now on the table, and there's recognition by everybody that there will be no going forward, no return to the status quo without a Palestinian state being created. This is bad news for Israel, but it's good news for Israel. Israel wants security. There will never be security without a Palestinian state, because there will always be conflict. There will always be a war. Israel somehow believes that they can make this problem go away. They haven't. The only way this problem goes away is what we talked about earlier. You create a legitimate Palestinian state. You allow the Palestinian people now to have hope based upon their own hard work to create their own nation. And you instantly delegitimized the kind of violence that Hamas is promoting. You will compel Hamas to become a political entity dedicated to the growth and prosperity of a Palestinian state, or else they will be thrust into the trash bin of history by the Palestinian people.
So, enough about that. The reason why I wanted to play that was because obviously the Middle East in this particular time frame, in the current moment of time, is a bit of in some hostile waters, obviously because of what's going on with Israel and Hamas, and the fact that you have Saudi Arabia trying to play somewhat of a peacemaker of some sort, meaning that they are trying to, I guess, legitimize themselves as the negotiators of the entire region, and rightfully so, because if you are the ruler of Saudi Arabia, guess what? What is your nickname to the Muslim world? What? The custodian of the holy mosques, the two holy mosques, one in Medina and one in Mecca, so on and so forth. So what we have going on with Saudi Arabia right now is a situation where they understand how to negotiate. In other words, you look at the UFC, that's a great example of that. And you're probably wondering, how am I using the UFC and a UFC content related video to somehow talk about this conflict? Well, in some ways, a lot of it is relatively related, and a lot of it, well, not so much. Part of the reason why it's relatively related is because of the fact that if you don't have certain peace in the Middle East, and especially in Saudi Arabia, guess what? You're not going to have any of these sporting events that you want going on, because the entire region is going to be up in smoke. So in relation to what's going on with Hamas and its leadership, and not only that, the people that are trying to negotiate with them, such as other countries that are involved, Iran, you have Qatar, you have Saudi Arabia, you have Bahrain, you have all these people that are in neighboring that are in that neighboring regions of the Middle East, and that also includes Egypt, because guess what? Egypt is also on the verge of hosting themselves their own UFC fight nights, or perhaps maybe a pay-per-view. Saudis for sure are going to host a pay-per-view somewhere in March time, and they're going to try to do it before that big April card of UFC 300, which will more than likely probably take place in Vegas. But before that, they want to fill in a certain number of international cards they have going on. Traditionally, the UFC would have shows in March that would involve, let's say, London or maybe even Paris or something to that extent. Well, you can't have any of those if the entire region is on fire, right? So it's very important to talk about these things. But also, you got to understand a couple of things about this particular subject with Saudi Arabia. You know that the UAE is in business with the UFC, yet the UAE doesn't mind that Saudi Arabia is doing business with the UFC as well somewhere down the road, after they just had this big boxing match with Francis Ngannou, which, by the way, really ties in to this whole entire story. Now, why is that? For one, not to mention the fact that Francis Ngannou had this great opportunity of a lifetime, and having to do it without the UFC, and then not having to pay them a certain amount of money just so they can co-host or co-promote the entire promotion. I mean, it was an absolute slam dunk in his particular side of the fence. So we now know that Francis Ngannou won. John Jones, he somewhat won because of the fact that now that Francis left, it became a much easier matchup for John Jones to get in there and win the heavyweight championship, which, by the way, is his second weight class undisputed championship that he won in the UFC. So the problem now is that, let's just be honest, we can't consider him the lineal champion of the world when it comes to the undisputed UFC championship, because Francis left with bad terms of, well, being stripped of the title and not having the title in his hand, in terms of saying, well, you know what, I am now the world champion and I'm going to box the lineal world champion of the other sport. Instead, what he has going on is a situation where there's going to be a lot of questions. Who really is the baddest man in the world? And the problem is, you can't answer that question if you have John Jones in the UFC and then you have Francis Ngannou in the PFL while doing all these big boxing matches that are now available to him. So what is the solution here? Just like the beginning of the audio and everything that I had just mentioned, and everything that the audio had just mentioned, by the way, shout outs to Scott Ritter, who was a former UN weapons inspector and a former United States Marine officer at that. So try to put in perspective that the Saudis are going to try to negotiate the fight between Jon Jones and Francis Ngannou, along with the UFC. Now, what are some problems and issues with that? Well, just like with Israel's dilemma, and just like with Israel's ultimatum of certain subjects that, well, let's say, we're not going to do this. If you don't do this, we're not going to allow a Palestinian state because it's within our policy to not allow that. Who does this sound like? It sounds a lot like, well, the UFC. Because guess what? They're not going to co-promote with a guy like Jon Jones, who, by the way, is the lineal champion of the world. But what happens if he loses to a guy like Francis who's not in contract? You know what that's going to look like? Well, if you guys are fans of professional wrestling, you remembered what happened with CM Punk, right? The guy took on John Cena somewhere in 2011 or so, and, well, it was literally a do-or-die matchup. He was either going to win the championship or leave the WWE empty-handed. Lo and behold, he beats John Cena in the summer of 2011, becomes the undisputed WWE champion, and guess what? Rides off into the sunset with their belt. Now, obviously, this is a fictional world, not really in terms of the real MMA world and its contract negotiations and what they would allow and not allow, and especially on the subject of co-promotion, which is going to be a big no-no and a deal breaker for the UFC. So who comes in to try and negotiate this whole entire situation? Well, just like China. China came in there and negotiated with Iran and Saudi Arabia. And now it is Saudi Arabia's turn to go in there and, well, they need to go in there and negotiate with Francis Ngannou and Jon Jones and get this fight together. Because guess what? Everybody wants to see this fight. And the Saudis can afford to pay everybody. Now, irregardless of the fact that, well, maybe Francis Ngannou should have waited or this and that, you don't know that because you don't know that the UFC was going to do a deal with Saudi somewhere down the road when all this man is thinking about is his current negotiations that he has going on within having to expire his contract after one fight. So that's something you have to take into serious consideration. Well, the Saudis, you also have to take into consideration, have insurmountable amounts of wealth, meaning that they can afford to literally do whatever they want, and that involves sporting events and geopolitical decisions and power moves. This is something you can never deny from the Saudis. Now, are they going to try and do the same thing with the UFC? Perhaps. Because guess what? It couldn't be a better time to do it. Just like what that gentleman said earlier in the audio, Scott Ritter. He said that there isn't a better time to create peace in the Middle East than now. Which, by the way, sounds very positive, considering that the way that the world looks at this conflict seems like it's going to be an open door for World War III of some sort. But the reality is that in business, it's not really conducive for you to make enemies because it's not going to do any good for your bottom line. It's not going to do any good for the money that you're trying to obtain and the gains that you're trying to maneuver within these business deals. It's just not helpful to make enemies, which is why Iran decided to take the decisions that they made, and it's the reason why they vehemently deny funding Hamas in any kind of way, because you know what? They're not trying to create instability in the region, at least according to that gentleman. So it's important to know this. With the Saudis, they do this on a geopolitical global scale. Why can't they do this in the world of professional fighting? So this is something you definitely got to look out for, which is why I'm titling this particular video something to the extent of Francis Ngannou versus Jon Jones. The Saudis need to make it happen. And then on the parentheses, geopolitical implications of the Middle East. So quite a great title that I just came up with. I'm probably going to have to rewatch this before I go and re-upload it so I could remember the title. But nonetheless, it's a great title and it's highly appropriate for this particular subject at hand. Now, what are some issues and what are some pros and cons in making this happen? Well, for one, let's talk about why the UFC would actually consider it. Okay, for one, you got to take into consideration this is John Jones's last time of ever, let's say, perhaps maybe fighting. There was a rumor that he was going to fight Stipe and then just ride off into the sunset. Maybe fight Tom Aspinall or perhaps maybe Sergey, and then that would be it. He would ride off into the sunset, nothing more, nothing less, and retire undefeated, 2 world championships under his belt, and that'll be that. Well, the issue is that that's not an issue at all if you're the UFC. Because let's say if he wins the fight against Francis Ngannou, well, you have to vacate the belt anyway and then have another interim championship, or maybe perhaps they're going to crown a future champion in this interim fight at UFC 285 with Sergey versus Tom Aspinall. Maybe that's what they're going to do. Eventually, they're going to do that. If Francis ends up leaving as the world champion, again, it's not like it's the first time that that's ever happened. So it's not going to change the ethos and the trajectory of your entire company and what it is that you stand for exactly. It's just everything's going to be left intact, and you're going to crown a new champion anyway. So why not do a super fight like this? On top of that, the Saudis can facilitate it. They can pay everybody the money that they need. And guess what? They're not worried about return investments, which is the reason why in recent times you've seen Chael Sonnen and Ariel Helwani argue in their little heated debate that they had at the MMA Hour just days after the Francis Ngannou and the Tyson Fury fight. And what was the fight about? Well, Chael's case was that, well, the Saudis made zero return in this. Guess what? Ariel Helwani's case, which, by the way, I sort of agree with him on, that's not what it's about with the Saudis. They're not trying to beat Floyd Mayweather's pay-per-view records or Conor McGregor's pay-per-view records or Brock Lesnar's or any pay-per-view star out there. They're not trying to do any of that. If they can, great. If they don't, it's not a big deal, because guess what? Their number one goal out of this whole entire thing is to create sports tourism for their kingdom, which is not a bad idea. So guess what? That's what's going on. That's what's going to happen. And the Saudis are going to try to somehow negotiate themselves into getting this Francis Ngannou John Jones fight in the octagon. Now, the problem is it going to be with the PFL or the UFC? Well, I could see a situation where they build up, let's say, a PFL versus UFC card, or maybe have guys that are a combination of PFL and UFC fighters mix and match together, maybe a UFC fight, and then maybe a PFL fight, and then maybe a fight between a UFC fighter and a PFL fighter, and somewhere in between, or maybe have one of these weird undercards where, let's say, some guys fight for a contract. Maybe they have an Ultimate Fighter prior to that matchup, PFL versus the UFC, with ESPN hosting it. And why not? The ESPN is already the distributor of PFL and the UFC at the same time, on top of all the other big boxing matches out there, including Queensberry Queensberry Promotions with Frank Warren and Tyson Fury, which, by the way, was the host of the Francis Ngannou and Tyson Fury fight. So these are the things that we really got to look out for when it comes to making this John Jones and Francis Ngannou fight. It's a mountain to climb. It seems impossible because of the past occurrences that the UFC has done in terms of their practices, in terms of not allowing co-promotions, in terms of being limited to the type of sponsorships that you walk into the cage with. So all of these things have to be taken into factors when you try to understand negotiating in this type of business matter and in this type of business endeavors and the people that are involved in it, just like with Middle Eastern politics as mentioned. But either way, the way that everything sounds and the way that this is going to work out, it seems very positive for not only the region of the Middle East to somehow have a chance of peace and a blueprint that can be, let's say, followed in a reasonable manner to make ends meet in these questions that, let's say, both parties or all the parties involved want answered. But then also, it's a positive time for combat sports, being able to make the fights that you want, irregardless of pay-per-views, irregardless of who is the A side, who is the B side. Is this going to cost much? Are we going to have the right investment returns? Because let's face it, the majority of why fights are not made is because of the fact that the money just isn't right. And not only is the money not right, it's within a situation that a lot of companies are not willing to invest because they just don't have the means to lose money in $100 million range the way that the Saudis can. But for the Saudis, it's a much bigger reason why they are doing these sporting events. And you can say that it's because they want to make the fans happy around the world. You could say that maybe because they are boxing and mixed martial arts fight fans themselves and other sporting fans in other disciplines that they want to host. But either way, it's a great time for combat sports for all these fights to be made without any reservations from anybody and without any gains or losses having to be worried about. So, guys, like and subscribe. Let me know what you guys think. If you would like to see a John Jones versus Francis Ngannou fight, and at what capacity are we going to get that? Are we going to get it at a PFL cage? Are we going to get it at a UFC cage? More than likely, I'm going to go with the latter, perhaps the UFC cage, because guess what? The Saudis, they could literally open up their own MMA league. You know who else can literally open up their own MMA league? Elon Musk. He can also open up his own MMA league. But the problem is they don't have the lineage, they don't have the longevity of having fans trust them, and they don't have the roster. The UFC already has that, and this is the reason why the UFC and Saudi Arabia decided to do business straight away, just right after they were doing business with the Emiratis. So, like and subscribe. Inshallah, we can see this fight somewhere down the road because, let's be honest, it's the only fight that fans really want to see out of these two. Most people don't even really want to see Stipe versus John. Stipe was just there because he was the next best thing. And now that John is injured, Stipe wanted no parts of this fight because John Jones was the name that he had in mind, and he's not about to go in there with some young killers like Tom Aspinall and Sergey, who have a name but don't have the greatest value. So, inshallah, they make this fight, and inshallah, you will like and subscribe.